So yeah, this is the third session, and we just had a testimony from Pastor Denise Nelson. I think she kind of captured most of the core points. I almost feel maybe I don't need to share so much more, but I think she was able to really capture the heart behind the significance of this presentation, and I'll try to articulate some of the key points that were discovered in the exposition of the divine principle. So a brief recap. Last session, we did talk about God's ideal, why God created, how he wanted all of us to fulfill the three great blessings: to mature ourselves and multiply our families and have dominion. And that our true value comes from really understanding our purpose, living towards that purpose, and having others appreciate our unique kind of contribution. We also went over, spiritual growth and how we can grow as human beings, how we're designed to actually grow our spirits. So that was last session, and but when we look, and Denise mentioned it in her testimony as well. When we look at the reality around us, without looking too far, we can easily see that the current reality is not God's ideal, doesn't reflect what God wanted from the very beginning. So this really begs the question, what went wrong? Without really understanding the source of the problem, we can never address the issue. It's kind of like if you go to a doctor, first thing they do is they do an assessment to see what's wrong. And then they have to identify the root of the problem in order to be able to address it. Same thing with us. If God is all powerful, why is there evil in this world? This has always been a question that humans throughout history has been asking. So this was brought in the introduction of the divine principle as well. But one of the key things is that actually the quote from the exposition says it quite well. I'm reading from the exposition of the divine principle. All people have an original mind, which inclines them to pursue goodness. Yet even without our being aware of it, we are driven by evil forces to perform evil deeds, which we do not want to do. In Christianity, the master of these evil forces is known as Satan. Therefore, to extirpate evil by its root and thereby end sinful history and usher in an era of goodness, we must first expose the motivation and origin of Satan and recognize the destruction he has wrought upon human life. This explanation of the human fall will clarify on these issues. So as I mentioned before, we have this contradiction, and unless we can identify where evil comes from, and if we don't understand how it came about, there's no way we can actually overcome this problem. So in order to identify the root of the problem, we go back to the Genesis story in the human fall. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the story. I'm going to read from the Holy Bible. As you know, after God created the world, at the end, he created Adam and Eve. And it says in Genesis 1:31, and God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. And there was evening and there was morning, a sixth day. So after he created everything, he created Adam and Eve. And then after giving them the three blessings, he did give them one warning. The Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to till it and keep it. And the Lord God commanded the man, saying, you may freely eat of every tree of the garden, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for in the day that you eat of it, you shall die. So God gave Adam and Eve everything in the Garden of Eden, but he warned them, do not eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So, but as you know, what happened, right? The serpent says, "Now the serpent was more subtle than any other wild creature that the Lord hath made. He said to the woman, Did God say, You shall not eat of the tree of the garden? And the woman said to the serpent, We must eat of the fruit of the trees of the garden. But God said, You shall not eat of the fruit of the tree which is in the midst of the garden, neither shall you touch it, lest you die. But the serpent said to the woman, You will not die, for God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was to be desired to make one wise, she took of its fruit and ate. And she also gave some to her husband, and he ate. Then the eyes of both were opened, and they knew that they were naked, and they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves aprons. The story goes on. Basically, God comes to Adam and Eve, and Adam and Eve feel ashamed, so they hide, and it's exposed that they had disobeyed the commandment not to eat of the fruit, and they were kicked out of the Garden of Eden. So, according to this story, it was the eating of the apple, this fruit, that was the root of evil and sin in the world. But this begs the question, why would God put such a tempting fruit in front of Adam and Eve to tempt them with it? I mean, it's one thing to it's kind of like putting a jar of cookies in front of my kids and saying, don't eat of this fruit until I say you can. But this is even worse because God says that if you eat of this fruit, you shall surely die. So it's almost like God putting, as a parent, putting poisonous cookies in front of your children and saying, don't eat of it unless you will die. Why would a God of love put such a tempting fruit in front of Adam and Eve if he knew of the consequences? Also, the other question is, can something like a fruit, like an apple, cause the original sin, which is transmitted through all descendants? That's also a question. Can something that you eat physically cause an effect on your descendants? And the third question is, why would Adam and Eve risk their lives to eat of this fruit? I mean, I understand something might be tempting, but if you knew that this fruit that I gave you is delicious, but you have a small chance that you might die. It's kind of like in Japan, they have this poisonous fish called fugu. And if you prepare it wrongly and you puncture the poison sac, then it can cause death. And if there was just a 5% chance that you were going to die from eating that, would you still do that? Probably not. So why did Adam and Eve risk their lives to eat this fruit? So these are some of the questions that naturally arise from listening to this story. So one way to understand the truth, the deeper truth behind that story, is to understand that many things in the Bible are not literal, but symbolic. It's kind of like how Jesus uses metaphors and stories to teach the truth. And there are many times in the Bible where the messages that are given have multiple meanings, if you were to understand it. So if we understand that there is symbolism and a metaphor in the Bible, then we can take another look at this story and be able to see some deeper truths. So we're going to go back to this story. And one thing I do want to say and encourage is, for those who are listening today, this 10-hour DP course is really like a summary of the divine principle. There is an extended 7-day version where we go into more detail. And I do encourage everyone to, if you haven't done so already, to go through a reading of the actual text, because there you will find really the detailed thought process and truth and revelation that's included to help cover the whole story. So this is really at best a summary of some of the key points that are covered. So if we understand there's symbolism in the Bible, then each of these key elements in the story must represent something. So the tree of life, what does the tree of life symbolize? There are quotes in the Bible which actually refer to that, where the tree of life, from different verses, we can understand represents an ideal man who has fulfilled, realized the ideal of creation. As you know, after the fall, God sent a cherubim, which is an angel with a sword, to protect the tree of life so that the humans cannot access the tree of life anymore. Also, there's a Bible quote that says that, you know, the purpose or the goal of humanity is to pursue or fulfill the tree of life. So there's symbolism and verses in the Bible that imply that the tree of life represents the ideal man or the perfected man. So what does the tree of knowledge of good and evil represent? Well, it's interesting because in the Bible, there's these two trees that are mentioned, tree of life and tree of the knowledge of good and evil. There's also Adam and Eve. So if the tree of life represents ideal man, then the tree of knowledge of good and evil must represent the ideal woman or the perfected Eve. So next is really understanding the serpent. What is this? Who is this serpent? What does this serpent represent? I already have it here. It says fallen angel. If we look at the serpent, there are certain hints. We know that the serpent was able to talk with people. Now, besides the movies, does anyone know of a serpent that speaks English or Japanese or any language? No, but this serpent in the Bible was able to talk with people. Also, the serpent knew the will of God. The serpent asked Eve, "Oh, is that what God told you, that you shouldn't eat?" Right? You also know that the serpent lived in heaven. It says here in the Bible, the great dragon was thrown down, that ancient serpent who is called the devil and Satan. He was thrown down to the earth. It lived in heaven. So we know that in Revelations 12:9 that this serpent used to live in heaven before it was thrown down. So this, again, there's more evidence than this, but those are some of the key evidence that show that the serpent actually symbolizes a spiritual being. And that spiritual being, although was created for a good purpose, later fell and became Satan. And the only beings that had all of these characteristics were angels at that time. And particularly, the archangel Lucifer was the one that was imbued with God's intellect as a servant to help with the creation. So we understand that this serpent actually represents the archangel Lucifer. There's a quote in Jude 6:7. Let's see. Let me go back. Yeah, so in Jude 6:7, it says, and the angels that did not keep their own position but left their proper dwelling have been kept by him in eternal chains in the nether gloom until the judgment of the great day. Just as Sodom and Gomorrah and the surrounding cities, which likewise acted immorally and indulged in unnatural lust, serve as an example by undergoing a punishment of eternal fire. So this is also a hint of what kind of actually from Jude 6:7 we can infer that the angel fell as a result of an illicit sexual relationship. So what does what does the fruit represent? The fruit represents the love of Eve. So a few more quotes I'm going to read from the principle that explains this point. In Genesis 3:7, we can infer that Adam and Eve's sexual parts were the instrument of their sinful deeds. So if the eating of the fruit was the root of the cause of the fall, then we have to understand, what does this fruit represent? In Genesis, we read that before they fell, Adam and Eve were both naked and not ashamed. But after the fall, they felt ashamed of their nakedness and sewed fig leaves together into aprons to cover their lower parts. So normally, when you know you did something bad, then you automatically try to cover up what you did that was bad. So in the case of, let's say, children and cookies, if you stole the cookies and you ate them, usually what the kids do, they cover their mouths and hands, right? Because they want to hide the parts with which they committed their sin. The fact that Adam and Eve, they covered their lower parts after eating of the fruit implies that what they were ashamed of was using their lower parts, their private parts, in this act of sin. So by reading these different Bible, again, this is not explicit in the Bible. These are really trying to draw truths from the symbolism of the Bible, knowing that the angels do have the capacity to sin, knowing that the serpent must have represented an angel with knowledge that also can communicate with Adam and Eve, and knowing that eating of the fruit represents sexual love, then we can see that both the angel and the human beings fell due to an illicit sexual relationships. Human beings and angels are the only spiritual beings in the universe who are capable of having love relationships. And we can deduce that the illicit sexual relation must have involved the angel and human beings. One more biblical quote. In John 8:44, Jesus said, "You are of your father the devil." And it's interesting because that quote really implies that we have inherited something. We are the children of the devil. And that makes sense if the source or the root of sin was an illicit sexual relationship, we can see that it can carry out through the lineage. Another thing about the fruit, which is interesting, is the knowledge of good and evil, which means that the fruit actually has a chance of being either good or evil, depending on the relationship. Eve should have borne good children through her godly love, but instead she bore evil children. And that was because she entered into this relationship in a premature state with the archangel instead of Adam. So if we go to the story again, we know that the serpent first tempted Eve, and after Eve was tempted, she actually tempted Adam and shared the fruit with Adam. So the initial relationship with the angel was a source of the spiritual fall between the archangel and Eve. And then the subsequent relationship between Eve and Adam, where she tempted Adam and he took the fruit, represents the physical fall. Okay, so I'm gonna take a moment here to kind of take in the impact or significance of this point. Again, throughout history, we have Christians and humanity has understood mainly that the fall was through disobedience and the eating of a fruit. But by identifying and understanding that the root of sin is actually an immature, illicit sexual relationship, so many things start to connect. You know, if you think about the cause of a lot of the conflict in this world even today, all of it ties back to fallen love. You know, battle over women, lust, conflict, all of it can actually be rooted back to this immoral or immature sexual love. So it actually starts to make sense that, you know, something like this could actually cause or can be at the root of all the conflict that we see in the world today. So this is really important because once we understand that that's the root, then now we have a chance at addressing and solving the root problem. If we don't understand the root, there's no way we can solve the problem. And in the, I remember one movie, there was a quote, "The greatest trick that Satan ever played on humanity was to convince him that he doesn't exist." So by us being ignorant of this truth, we've been influenced by evil and not knowing how to address it. So this is very, in one sense, sad, but also hopeful. By knowing the root of sin, we can actually start to find a solution to address it. Okay, so we're going to go on to the motivation of the fall. How did this happen in the first place? So I'm going to go through this a little bit quickly because of time. But basically, God first created Lucifer, and Lucifer was an angel, actually an archangel, one of the three top angels. And God assigned him to really help with assisting, preparing everything for Adam and Eve. But it was basically a master-servant relationship. Angels are created as servants. So that was a relationship. And God did love Archangel in his position as a servant. Then God created Adam and Eve. But the difference was Adam and Eve were in the position of a son and daughter to God. So the relationship is completely different. So God really loved Adam and Eve. It says multiple times more than he had ever loved Lucifer, because the relationship is different. It's kind of like the difference between the love you have for your children versus the love you have for your landscaper, you know, or your barber, or someone who you hire to serve your family versus the love that you have for your own children. That was the difference. So when that happened, Lucifer actually felt a lack of love or a decrease of love. and he started to feel jealous of Adam and Eve. Why are these, children deserving more love and attention from God than me? And the archangel knows so much, has so much power, so much knowledge, so much authority. Lucifer felt he was receiving less love than before unjustly. But the truth was that God loved Lucifer the same as before. Just when compared to the love that God had for Adam and Eve, it felt much less. So Lucifer felt, he was receiving less, so he wanted the same central position that human beings had. So that's why Lucifer seduced Eve. This was actually the motivation of the spiritual fall, was Lucifer wanted to have the central position, and that's why he tempted Eve. So Lucifer left due to his excessive desire, and Eve formed a common base. She actually responded to Lucifer's temptation, and she wanted to open her eyes and become like God before the time was right, formed a common base, and began give and take action, which led them to consummate an illicit sexual relationship on the spiritual plane. So even if the archangel tempted Eve, if Eve had said, actually, no, let me check with God, I know God said not to do this, then this could have been prevented. But Eve did reciprocate with that temptation from Lucifer, and she succumbed to it. Then Eve seduced Adam, but her motivation was slightly different than Archangel. Her motivation was, once she had that relationship with Lucifer, she felt guilty. She knew that wasn't a proper relationship. Her eyes were open, she knew, and she wanted to go back to her original position. And so she thought that she could do that by relating with Adam, who was meant to be her spouse. So she interacted with and tempted Adam instead. She wanted to get rid of her guilt and dread and stand before God again, and that was the motivation behind the physical fall. Again, Adam responded and formed a common base in this situation. Adam could have said, Eve, I don't know what you're doing, but God said not to do this. Let's go back to God and let's check with God. But Adam fell to the temptation of Eve and again began give and take action. And the power of this unprincipled love induced Adam to abandon his position. And that led to the physical illicit sexual relationship. So again, through that, the relationship between God and Lucifer was disconnected. And step by step, the relationship between God and Eve and God and Adam were disconnected, because instead of having an authentic love relationship that was pure in relation between God and Eve and God and Adam, that was tainted by a premature illicit sexual relationship, starting with the archangel. So this is again a summary, but Lucifer wanted to attain the same position in human society. His feelings of lack of love ultimately motivated his actions, and he manipulated God's children through his self-centeredness and inability to love Adam and Eve from God's viewpoint. So if Archangel, even though he felt less love, if he had still chosen to serve Adam and Eve properly and not abuse his position, but serve Adam and Eve as the future, king and queen of creation, then the archangel would have received not just love from God, but would have received love from Adam and Eve, and he would have been in a very amazing position. But he actually stepped outside of his role and manipulated and reversed his role. Sorry, I'm going a little over time, so I'm going to quickly try to cover the last few slides here. Why could something like this happen? You know, God is all-knowing, all-powerful. Why would God create a situation where a mistake as big as this could happen? And the only reason we could understand this is by understanding that God, although he designed the world with principle, he created love to be stronger than the principle because he wanted to rule the universe or experience the universe and relate with Adam and Eve based on love, not based on law. So yeah, love is something where God cannot force people to love him. This is actually our portion of responsibility, and that's what makes love so powerful and so special, is because it's only given by choice. It's not something that can be forced. So even though that left the possibility of the fall, God took the chance because he believed in the possibility and the potential of love. And this was only possible because Adam and Eve were still in a growth stage and they were still immature in their love. So the fact that they were immature and they were tempted during that time, that's what led to the fall. And that's also why God gave the commandment, because he knew that he needed something very strong in order to prevent them from making a mistake during this growth period so that they could mature and be ready to receive God's blessing to enter into that relationship as husband and wife. So in short, this was what God originally planned. He wanted Adam and Eve to grow in love as his children. And when the time was ripe, God was going to bless Adam and Eve and say, now you may eat of the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. But unfortunately, before that happened, Lucifer, who was in a position as a servant, as the archangel, he tempted Eve because he wanted that position, central position. And instead of based on a matured love towards each other and God, the first love relationship was ridden with guilt and self-centeredness. So that was the difference. And because that love, that initial love relationship was centered on guilt and selfish love, the fruits of that love, in the sense of children and descendants, also inherited all of that false love aspects. And that's what led to the reality of today's world. So if you go through, expand that throughout history, we can understand that what God originally intended, because it was stolen by Satan and inserted from the beginning with false love instead of true love, if you expand that relationship, that first relationship was centered on self-centered, immature love, we can understand how throughout history, if you expand that to the family, society, nation, world, that's going to just multiply this false love. And that's why we don't see God's ideal of creation yet. And as a result, that's really what why we see the world in the way it is today. And I want to conclude this section by reiterating what Pastor Denise mentioned in the beginning, which was, Genesis 6:6, where God says that this grieved God so much that he wondered why he regretted creating man. That this almighty God, all-powerful God, would actually regret creating Adam and Eve. That's how much his heart was broken at the time of the fall, because he hoped for the greatest possible experience of love, and it was stolen and turned into shame and disconnection with Adam and Eve due to the result of the fall. So really, this is a story of the heartbreak of God. And yeah, that's kind of what Reverend Moon was able to disclose through prayer and revelation and through really debating to root out and understand this deeper truth of what happened to bring about evil in this world. Okay, so that's a wrap of the first part of the fall of man.